And we appreciate your patience and enduring with us. We're starting now at 3:14 p.m. Um, and we wanted to thank you all for coming out this afternoon for this very important discussion. Um, this program is called Come Together, and it's an effort to bring together local citizenry and community members around three important topics, which I will elaborate upon shortly. My name is Ken Clark. I am the director of the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights, and prior to that, served as director of Cornell United Religious Work for 16 years on the university campus. We chose to organize this event, that is our office and our co-sponsors, around three topics that intersect with this most important presidential election. Those areas are voting rights, criminal justice and reentry, and the rights of women and other underserved populations. The implications for this election, which will determine the future of democracy in the United States, are huge. This was a collaborative effort pulled together over a number of weeks and was organized by an organization called Your Voice and Your Vote, the Tompkins Civic Engagement Coalition, which also includes the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights and the Tompkins County Human Rights Commission. Excuse me. The League of Women Voters of Tompkins County, the Finger Lakes Independence Center, Rejoice to Vote, the Dorothy Cotton Institute, and the Dorothy Cotton Institute. Additional co-sponsors include the Ithaca Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Raise your hands, if you would. And the Alumni Chapter, the Iota Iota Lambda Alumni Chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Make yourself known, brothers. So also to the St. Paul's United Methodist Church is offered to serve as a co-sponsor as well. And I want to thank the members of these organizations and those who have been part of the planning over this last several weeks to make this event happen. Our first panel will address the importance of voting rights, and the panelists will be Dr. Margaret Washington, distinguished professor alumni of history at Cornell, Christian Flournoy, who was a sophomore at Cornell in pre-med, and hopefully when he comes here, Dr. Sean Eversley Bradwell. This panel, and I will also serve on the panel as a sort of a pinch hitter of sorts. So this panel will be moderated by Gavin Mosley. After the first panel, we will have a musical selection that's provided, and that will also follow the gap between the second and third panels. The second panel focuses on criminal justice reform and reentry, and the panelists are Tali Mugambe, who is the executive director of Ultimate Reentry Opportunity, and Ithaca Police Chief Thomas Kelly, who is new to our community, and will be moderated by Ciality Hackett. Thirdly, but not last, the rights of women and other underserved populations we will have as panelists Dr. Jada Hamilton, Larry Roberts, who is also a member of the Tompkins County Human Rights Commission, which advises my office, and Tilia Cordata. And so we will begin the first of our conversations together. This is also important, may I say, before I give way to Gavin as moderator, is that one of the things that we realize is that civic engagement does not begin and end with voting, but it continues in collaborative efforts like this and those which follow that seek to benefit the common good and expand the understanding and implementation of human rights. And one more thing, Ken Glover will be also talking with us during our session about the importance of the affidavit ballot and what's involved in filing an affidavit ballot. If, for instance, one runs across a situation in which they are confident that they have enrolled, but the records show otherwise. So Ken will be talking about what to do in a situation of that sort on this last day of early voting. So I'm going to ask the panelists for our first group to come and share this table.
All right, so I guess I will officially begin moderating this panel that's centered around voting rights. As Dr. Clark has already pointed out, we wanted to make sure we touched on 3 different buckets tonight that are going to impact all of us after Tuesday. So we've been told for several months the implications of Tuesday, but we've now shifted to what happens after Tuesday and protecting voting rights, as well as ensuring that all people, no matter their background, ethnicity, political persuasion, gender, or otherwise, that they're able to exercise their right post-Tuesday. So real quickly, we'll just introduce our panelist for this evening's event, Dr. Margaret Washington joined the Cornell History Department in 1988 as an associate professor. Her specialties are African American history and culture, African American women, and Southern history. She is one of the foremost authorities on the Black experience. And I must say, since we are in a church, it is very befitting because I said a lot of prayer as a Cornell graduate student on making it out of her class alive. But now, as a lecturer at Cornell, I think fondly on those times and really have implemented some of the practices that she had in her class and our class. So let's welcome Dr. Margaret Washington. We also have Dr. Ken Clark. Ken needs no introduction as he's already spoken to you all multiple times today, but Dr. Clark is the director of the Office of Human Rights for Tompkins County. He is an alumnus of Morgan State University as well as Colgate-Rochester Divinity School. He spent over a decade as the director of the Office of Religious Life at Cornell, and he's also a proud member of our fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. So with that, welcome Dr. Ken Clark. And last but certainly not least, and I know he's preparing to join us up at the front. We wanted to make sure that this was an intergenerational discussion because so many times I think we get caught in the idea of the baby boomers versus the millennials or Gen X versus Gen Z. We wanted to make sure that we were cultivating a space today where we could hear from the younger generation on their ideas and their thoughts. And what better way than to incorporate a student leader? So we have Christian Flournoy, who is a sophomore at Cornell University, but also has the distinction of being the vice president for diversity of the Cornell Student Assembly, as well as a brother of the Alpha chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Let's welcome Christian Flournoy. Christian. So we will, and Dr. Washington's joining us as well. We'll go ahead and get started. When we started brainstorming this particular event a few months back, it was centered around simply driving one day and hearing the melody to an old Beatles song called Come Together. So that's where we came up with the idea. And there were kind of three key buckets as we started putting things on paper, three key buckets that we wanted to touch on in relation to voting rights, one of which was coalition building and the ramifications of us not building coalitions, whether that's within the city, whether that's at the state level or federally. So we want to open up with just a broad-based question. Why does voting matter? Why does voting matter? We'll post that to our panelists.
So in my opinion, so this is actually my first presidential election that I voted in. So for me, and I'm all the way from Atlanta, Georgia. So I made sure to get my absentee ballot in. My parents even came up for parents weekend, gave it to them to make sure my mom mailed it, or not mailed it, she figured it herself. So voting ends up being, or has always been a very important thing for me. And that's just because it's an extension of your voice. There's a lot of things that I've seen in the country, a lot of things that, there's a lot of things that I've wanted to see improved. And I truly believe that my vote is a cast of my voice, and putting in my vote, especially in a state like Georgia, which in this election and past ones has been considered a swing state, is going to end up making an impact. And it is across the board with everyone's ballot, everyone's vote. It's an extension of your voice. And I think that no matter which way you're voting, it's important that you put it out there. You put out what you want to see change. And the way that you do that is via your vote.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. It's good to be here. And I will reiterate what the young brother said about voting. And I would like to add, just to think about why voting matters. Think about something that is in force right now. Think about Medicare. Think about Social Security. Think about the last, I think it was the last State of the Union address that now President Joe Biden made, and the question came up about Social Security. And one of the issues that was brought up was the move to abolish it, which is sort of under the radar, but they're talking about it. And he brought it out in the open, which of course shocked people. And then they said, no, no. And he made a commitment, made them commit in front of the entire nation in the middle of the State of the Union address that there would be no move to dismantle Social Security. But Social Security is legislation that came into effect during the Franklin Roosevelt administration. And it's an amazing piece of social welfare legislation that we could very easily lose. It only takes a legislative process. And when the George Bush II was president, he initiated conversation about that. But he saw that there was so much pushback, he dropped it. But the point I'm making is that it's on some legislative agenda. So voting matters if you are on Social Security, if you anticipate getting on Social Security, because that is a kind of legislation that can be gone. The same thing about civil service. We take the Civil Service Commission for granted. The Civil Service Commission was initiated during the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. He was the president from 1870 to 1876. Before that, there was no Civil Service Commission. The rule was, to the victor belongs the spoils. Whoever got in office would appoint their men or women, mostly men, from the janitors all the way up. So that's what we would lose if we don't vote. And so those are some of the issues of why voting matters. And then let me just give you one more example. The Chief Justice of the United States, Roger Taney, said in 1857, a Black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. That was the Dred Scott decision. That decision was overturned after the Civil War, when African-American people who'd been in this country for hundreds of years became citizens for the very first time through the 14th Amendment, that all persons born in the United States are automatically citizens. Those amendments have to be ratified by the states. So if you don't vote for your state legislatures who support the kinds of issues that you feel are valuable, then you lose. Number two, the greatest barrier to voting, I think, is complacency. Just feeling that your vote doesn't matter. And voting matters, especially at the local level, but nationally as well. And we tend, if we vote at the local level, we tend to also vote at the national level. And so that's why a forum like this is important. To talk to people at the local level about voting, and that expands the interest and the commitment. And so that's why I think voting, among other things, but I'm not going to hog all the time. What does coalition building mean? Well, okay, when I think of coalition, I think of solidarity, because you can't have coalition without solidarity, and you can't have solidarity unless you agree. And I just want to just make one point. When the Civil War was over and Blacks and whites who had fought together to end slavery found themselves, some of them, I would say a good half of them, at loggerheads, these people who had been friends for decades, over voting. Women wanted the vote, Black men wanted the vote, and the federal government, the most progressive members of the federal government said, if you push for women, nobody gets it. So the move among African-American men, most African-American women, and white men who were in favor of Black male suffrage was that it was more imperative for Black men to get suffrage. That created a fissure among people who had worked together to end slavery. And I'll just give you a couple of quotes. and then end with the final one to bring us back to, the next issue. Frederick Douglass said, Black men need the vote more than women because, now remember that this is 1867, 1868, Civil War's over. There's no legislation to restrain white males in the South. They are burning Black homes. They are raping Black women. They are hanging Black men. The Southern Confederate soldiers have not been disarmed. They've come home with their guns. They're angry. They're wreaking havoc on the Black community. So it's within that context that Frederick Douglass says Black men have an urgency that women do not have. And then the white women, his former abolitionist associates, said, isn't that true of Black women as well? And he said, yes, but it is because they are Black, not because they are women. And then Sojourner Truth says, if you bait the suffrage hook with a Black woman, you will snag a Black man. And then the great abolitionist poet, Black woman's poet, Frances Ellen Watkins, brought it in full circle. And she said, we are all bound up together. Thank you.
Now do you all see why I was worried if I would pass our class? Dr. Clark, why does voting matter?
Voting matters because elections have consequences. Dr. Washington has laid out some of the consequences potentially that can go in one way or the other with regarding voting. Not as my ethics professor in Divinity School, who taught Martin Luther King Jr., said, not to decide is to decide. And when one does not vote because they let the perfect become the enemy of the good or the better, you decide fundamentally the fate of an election because one did not exercise the franchise that they have to let their voice be heard. Getting too politically pure is a problem. And as a result of that can lead, as we have seen in our recent history, that can alter the direction of an election. But it's also important for other reasons. It is important because, for example, when juries are called, they look at who votes. And that if one has a history of voting, there's a possibility that one might be called for jury duty as a jury of one's peers. This is particularly important as it relates to persons of color and others who in many cases, historically and even contemporarily, are not adequately represented in juries. But it also can determine what president chooses what of federal judges. And we have also seen the consequence of that well over the last 2+ decades. And so for those reasons, and not to speak of many others, voting is important. I mean, it is an action one can take in a democracy. However challenged that democracy may be, no matter how distant the ideals of the democracy are from the realities that happen within it, that voting is an important and necessary component of what it means to be a citizen.
So kind of continuing down, and members of the community, you've been given a connection card. We'll have about 5 or so minutes once we move through our next 2 questions to kind of pull together some of the things that you wanted to ask of our panelists. So if you have a card and you've written anything down, if you could hold it up and one of our organizers will pick that up from you and we'll get those answered. Christian brought up a very interesting point earlier with the idea of being away from home and voting and making sure that you're taking advantage of the franchise, making sure that you're being able to be civically engaged. And I think that brings to light as we look across this election and the previous one, the idea of barriers. We see that a lot of states have moved to, or several states have moved to mail-in ballot initiatives where you can simply get a ballot in the mail and mail it back. We also have seen, I think some states are moving towards the idea of automatic registration. With that being said, what do you all see currently as the greatest barrier? I know Dr. Washington touched on this a little bit in her answer. What do you all see currently as the greatest barrier to voting? We'll start with Dr. Clark and then work our way down.
Greatest barrier to voting
Current.
currently? I would say, I mean, just to take a stab at this. I think indifference. Which is sort of alludes to what I said earlier. But indifference, apathy, just sort of thinking that the vote does not count. That can be a huge barrier. Of course, too, I mean, when we look at all of what has happened since the key oversight provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act were basically scuttled by the Supreme Court. It is the type of tactics and voter suppression, voter intimidation, these types of things also can be a barrier to voting. Those are just a couple of things I would say about this. Dr. Washington?
You know, after the 2020 election, I'm sure that you realized that the states were going to putting extra energy into managing, shall we say, voter registration and elections. And so one obstacle to voting may be the politicization of exercising the franchise. And I think, for example, of the state of Georgia, your home state, when they began, after Biden won the election, and the new governor was Kemp, unfortunately, and in spite of the fact that, you know, we thought Stacey Abrams came close, but she didn't quite get there. One of the first things he did with his majority in the Georgia legislature was to pass restrictions on voting registration, including things like not being able to give people water while they're standing in line. And what was impressive to me, and what I noticed, aside from these egregious laws that were being passed, as well as the arrest of one of the legislative women for going in to the conference room. She was arrested, a Black woman. But in addition to that, when they were signing this bill, which was basically aimed at people of color in Georgia, in the background of the picture was a huge mural of a plantation, which was like a reminder of going back. And if you notice my t-shirt, going back in time, history repeating itself. And it was almost a very surreal message that the governor and the legislature were giving to, unfortunately, the white people of Georgia, that this is our motto of this mural of this plantation, this image of slavery. We don't want these people to vote. That was basically the message that I got. Now, those are the kinds of things, it's very surreptitious. It's not obvious, but it's there. And just like I noticed it on television, people who are right there in Georgia notice it too. And then I also will point out that one of the writers for the New York Times, Charles Blow, who's an African-American editorial writer, made the decision to move back to Georgia. And that's a decision that a lot of people are making, especially African-Americans, but not all African-Americans, to change the political dynamics of some of the southern states. And change them from, I don't like these terms, but you know, they're common, from red to blue. And to, and so what I've saw the Kemp administration doing is attempting to counter that, and not so much with the franchise as with the message they were sending to people in the state of Georgia, essentially to whites who would adhere to that, we want to go back in time. And so that's why we have this mural of this plantation. So those are just some of my thoughts about the question.
I would say that this kind of relates to both things that have been previously mentioned, but I say that the greatest barrier is education. And I think that that has a lot to do, for instance, in terms of things that Kemp passed, every 10 years, there's redistricting that goes on for voting. So under his administration, that redistricting did happen for the counties. And not many of you probably know, Georgia's counties are already very, very oddly drawn up. And it just, his redistricting of them made them even worse in a way, and also can sway voting and things of that nature. But the education part is the important thing, because, and this is kind of back to why voting matters. There's a lot of things that are on the ballot this year. There's major things like the Department of Education, which is a very odd thing to say that that's on the ballot. There's like the FDA as well is on the ballot, and things of that nature that have large implications. And many people just don't know about that. And that's one thing that I've seen. Like I said, this is my first presidential election that I was able to vote in. And so I've just been very tapped in trying to like be able to know as much as I can, know what's going on, what type of policies and things like that. And I think even from my perspective as a first time voter, as someone that's part of Gen Z, our communication, social media, things like that is our primary source. Sometimes you have news. I don't have cable television in my dorm, so the only thing I'm able to really see is what's maybe on my Instagram or what pops up on the news app. And really being able to see policies that are posted, certain things about like I know a couple things that I've seen is like child tax credits, housing credits for first time home buyers. Like those are policies and things that I have been able to learn via my social network, my Instagram, my seeing the Huffington Post, New York Times, things like that. And in one part, the education is a willingness to. You mentioned indifference before. Being like willing to learn what is actually going to be happening, what people want, or not what people, what candidates are actually supporting, what policies they're wanting to pass. But another part is making sure that you're hearing everything. Because if I'm only hearing something from one side and I'm not hearing the type of policies or the type of perspectives that people on the other side hear, it's a lot harder to make a decision when you're in an echo chamber. Because essentially, if you're in that echo chamber, you're not making a decision. You're just going along with what everyone else is saying. And so I truly believe that education is a key aspect of a voting barrier. I mean, there's other things. There's with voting in line, knowing that you can't go up and give someone water. You just mentioned a lot of things like from my home state, and it just made me start thinking like about a lot of them, because there are a lot of problems with voting. But education is what I would definitely say. I believe that's the biggest barrier.
So those are good points, and we're going to, so for the sake of time, combine our last question with a couple of these questions and close with another question. But I'm reminded, I like Christian come from the South, and in another life, I worked for what was then the newly Republican controlled Tennessee General Assembly, which at that time was a 52-48 split, happened around the time of a census. So that went from a 52-48 split to within an 18-month period, a 70-30 split, 70-29 split, all because of redistricting. And I bring that to light because that is when I was introduced to the saying that politicians make strange bedfellows. This election cycle, we have seen coalitions being built, ranging from Liz Cheney siding with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, her father, Dick Cheney, coming out in support of a Democrat. Things that in this lifetime we've never seen before and we probably will never see again. Someone posed a question about third parties. As we move forward in the decades to come and the elections to come, do we think that it would be a little bit easier for us to break down some of these barriers and create some of these new coalitions that we've saw across the last couple of years if we had a third party? Or do you all believe that this type of coalition building that we're seeing, crossing party lines, crossing racial lines, crossing gender lines, if we're seeing all of these things come together, do you think that this is the coalition of the future?
I would say that I think my exposure to the third party and just kind of in general, there's a lot, has been minimal up until this year, simply because this year there's at least one person, Cornel West, is just someone that I had an interest in, and I just have, and I learned about him, and so I knew about him also running as well. And I think that in this election specifically, the use of the third party is what some will say, like a vote for the third party or vote for anyone else, is not necessarily a vote for a Democrat or for Kamala Harris. And I think that I think it's an interesting perspective. I don't necessarily fully think that it's true because you're voting for who you want to vote for. But I think that in the future, the way that people align themselves politically and kind of work together, I think it is possible and maybe even beneficial if it ends up evolving into something that's a bit larger than a two-party system. But I think that right now in this current election cycle, and I was actually talking to my mom about this a couple of days ago. It's from what I've seen right now, it's not like blue versus red in terms of like Democratic versus Republican. It's a lot of, I mean, some people will say extreme, like extremist versus extremist, but the this election isn't necessarily about the policies or about like the parties and their beliefs and things like that. It's a lot based off of people in particular. And I think there's certain things to say about that in terms of when you're voting for someone that is supposed to be the president and what they're supposed to be representing. And I think that that's what we should move on from. I don't think that this idea of this kind of like we use the Republican Party, for example. In my opinion, from what I've seen over the past years, the Republican Party and where it is now is not the same as what it used to be. And that's just simply because of certain extreme beliefs that have come on that side and have created kind of an area that is a lot more focused on one thing. But on the Democratic side, it's also somewhat the same way. There's people that are a lot more focused on particular person and their particular ideas. And that's where we are now as a society, as an election, and that's what we have to vote for. And I think right now we do need to make that decision. We do need to be able to pick between that. But in the future, I don't think it should be as and somewhat closed-minded that we're just looking at one particular person and one particular idea that they are pushing, and that it does need to get back to be related to the policies that a party is associated with, because that's how people are affiliating themselves.
I think third parties are a good thing. And I think that they can be very viable. The Republican Party was a third party once upon a time. The Republican Party is the party of anti-slavery, if you can believe that. And so it shows you that the trajectory of a party can change. And so I think third parties are a good thing. I also, on the other hand, think that the two-party system can work very well. It worked very well in terms of getting Biden elected in 2020. I think a lot of that had to do with the coalition building, speaking of one of your questions, that was a result of George Floyd. people coming out across race, across class, across gender, over this outrage. And it basically, all over the world, and it was, it was beyond color. And many of those people went to the Democratic Party. But on the other hand, I think that the Democratic Party has lost its way, shall we say. So it's going to be very easy, I think, no matter what happens in this election, for a third party to rise. That's my prediction, because they have risen in this nation and they have been successful.
And I think of third party candidates who have been successful for, with a whole host of implications. I mean, there was, 1968, it was George Wallace getting 20% of the vote, made a very impactful, had an impact in getting Richard Nixon elected, who was running against the then Vice President Hubert Humphrey. In 1992, Ross Perot, getting somewhere around 20% of the vote, which ultimately helped Bill Clinton to win against George H.W. Bush.
Or if we want to look at 2000,
Yes.
what if there had not been,
Yes.
if there had not been a third party candidate, it is very possible on multiple fronts that Vice President Gore would have been elected by the Electoral College.
That's exactly right.
He would, I mean,
Yeah.
if we're honest, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, those three examples show how third parties can impact. I think they are a good thing. I think, let's say, for instance, in an election like this, some people, for instance, would support Jill Stein ride or die on the one hand. On the other hand, contextually, with so much at stake, there's the question of whether one has to really weigh the significance of that vote. It's ultimately the choice of the individual. But, again, going back to my seminary ethics professor, context dictates approach.
So as we prepare to close out, I'm reminded one of the things that I read was very intentional about reading prior to this panel was rereading the Gumbo Coalition by our alpha brother and president of the National Urban League, Brother Mark Morial. And one of the things that he pointed out was that speed means nothing without direction. So as I looked through these 4 questions that came in, it all centered around the idea that, a couple of ideas. Number one, that we many times focus on the things that divide us, not the things that unite us. The fact that there are, in relation to this election, and I want to make sure that we highlight you all, this is a nonpartisan event for multiple reasons. But we want to make sure that we're highlighting the fact that moving forward, there has to be this mixing of ideas to get us to the utopia that we want to be as a society. So another thing that came up was the idea that so many people have so many things to ask of Vice President Harris should she be elected? What is her direction? Where is she going with different party platforms? The closing question is this: what is our direction post Tuesday? Where do we go from here? In the words of our brother, Dr. Martin Luther King, what is our direction? After the election. Quite true. Quite true.
And I think that's going to determine our direction. Certainly going to determine mine. And I mean that literally. But it does, it depends on I think that they are so diametrically different. In a way that, and I can't think of in recent memory the diversions between the two candidates and the two parties, that it's really difficult to say.
Yeah.
Dr. Clark, what's our direction?
I think we have to see what happens on Tuesday or next Saturday. I mean, remember in 2020,
1:51 a.m. on Sunday.
yes.
Yeah.
Or even, Gore Bush, 36 days. Please. But Yeah, yeah, we're nonpartisan. But, I think we have to see what ensues. I mean, and be prepared for two possibilities. Either way you cut it, there's going to be backlash. There's going to be reaction. There will be, it will be felt at the local level as well as the federal level, at the state level. It really, I mean, it all depends on who gets those 270 electoral votes first. But we have to be prepared for, at any rate, conflict. It's just a question of what that conflict is going to look like and from whom.
I agree. I think that it's gonna be a lot different based on who ends up becoming the president. But I think one thing that we could definitely agree on is that any direction is gonna look more towards the local and state level after that. No matter who wins, you can say the next election, the next choices that we're gonna have to make are ones on the state and local levels. They're gonna have impacts in Congress, impacts in the House, Senate, and other areas where laws are passed, decisions are made, because the presidential election is very important. But a lot of legislation and other things are done by people in those lower, they're not necessarily lower, but just other tiered areas that have to deal with the state, have to deal with sorry, that other areas that have to deal with the state and other areas that are very important as well. So I think that's a direction that no matter which way the presidential election goes, we're gonna have to make sure you're still doing your part on your local and state areas.
Dr. Washington?
That's a really salient point, and it's a point that I was going to make, is that whoever wins the presidential election has to work with Congress. And you recall Obama's second administration, he won hands down. He did not have a Congress to work with. And the opposition, while the Obamas and his administration were partying and celebrating, they were gathering to see how they could do everything they could to stop every bit of legislation that the Democrats put forward. And they did. And so those elections, those state elections, those local elections are extremely important. It's not just the president. The president has to have a legislature to work with. So that's the other issue. We have to think locally. It's very, very important. And in our own, we know that in our own community. It's also the case with the states.
I was upended by literally our last question. I know we could probably go on with this for hours, but yes or no, and we'll end on this. National Popular Vote Initiative, yes or no? If we were to move to a purely popular vote system, yes or no?
100% yes.
100% as well.
I'm the moderator, so I'll stay out of it. But across generations, obviously, the answer was yes. Let's thank our panelists once again. That was awesome. So, folks, what we're going to do for the sake of time, we're going to have some very, very brief words by our dear brother, community activist Ken Glover. Just want to get up and talk to you about a few things, and then we'll immediately hand things over to C. Halliday Hackett, who's going to be moderating our next panel, very powerful discussion around the powers of community policing. And then that'll put us back into the flow. I want to remind folks, today is the final day to vote in the early voting section for the state of New York. And you are only a 1.5 to 2 minute walk away from a voting precinct. So if at any time over the next hour you feel the need to walk across the street and vote, feel free to do so. They close at 5. If you need to walk across the street and come back, we got an hour back, Dr. Washington. If you feel the need to walk across the street and vote and come back, please do so. But with that, we'll hand it over to Ken. Thank you again to our panelists. And then from there, we'll move with Ciality. Thank you all. Could we get, Cliff Simon, if we could get you to the front just to get a quick picture with the panelists?
I think it's important to keep in mind, as we come to election day, just want to remind people that polls are open from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. And that when you go to the polls, you want to make sure that you're able to vote. There's something called an affidavit ballot. And what an affidavit ballot allows you to do is that an affidavit ballot is a paper ballot that is used when a person who wants to vote, their name is not either in a poll book or is not in the computerized records. And you want to request that. You can, if you just Google the words like affidavit ballot New York, you will find out more information. You can also look on the website of the Tompkins County Board of Elections to find out where your polling place is. Because if you ask for an affidavit ballot, you have the right to receive it. So if you go there and you know that you've registered to vote and they say, we can't find your records and you know you're at the right polling place, request an affidavit ballot. They will give you that piece of paper and then you have to read it, fill it out, and then usually they ask you to sign the envelope. And then they should put it in a secure place. The history behind it is the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And for those of us who don't know what that's about, that comes out as a result of what happened at the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7th, 1965, when state and local police officers attacked nonviolent Black African Americans and other people who were just simply trying to exercise their American rights. So you say, what's at stake? What's at stake is that voting has specifically, is a specific one expression of political action. So everyone sitting in this room, you can pick up that phone tonight and call some of your friends, 5, 10, 15 people and say, hey, are you going to exercise a right that people literally died for? Are you going to exercise your right to what? Your human rights, as Malcolm would say, right? As Dr. King would say. Frederick Douglass, who was an important, Martin Luther King rather, he said, the ultimate measure of a person, where a person stands, is where they stand in times, not in times of comfort and convenience, but where they stand in times of what? Challenge and controversy. So the key point to keep in mind is that we want you to go out, ask for that affidavit ballot if you're at the right poll place and they say, I can't find your name in the records. Ask for it and you have the right to receive it. Governor Hochul has said that, and Attorney Letitia James have said that throughout this state, we're not in Florida, we're not in Georgia, we're not in Mississippi, we're not in Texas, but in this state, when people go to cast that ballot, they shall be able to go cast that ballot, right? Without anyone trying to intimidate them, without somebody trying to use acting under the color of law, and that you will have people who are there to help you. So I want to thank everyone for bringing us here. And Douglas talked about something. He said what? When Douglas was talking to people, he said that we have to keep in mind this fact. Find out what any people will quietly submit to, and you will have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong, which will be heaped upon them. What he was saying when he spoke at Canandaigua, New York, was to say, if you sit quietly, if you don't open your mouth, right, you will continue to be abused. You will continue to be disrespected. You'll be continued, your rights will be denied to you. But I want to thank the people who have put together this forum so that we can what? Use this one day that we have, all right, 2 days rather, to call people and encourage them to do what? Encourage them to pull that lever, to come out, because we are due in this nation, in this place, reparations for the injustice that's happened upon us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, or evening, afternoon, whatever I'm gonna say. I would also like to thank the committee who put this. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank the committee that put this event together and thank everyone who came out tonight or today. I have the pleasure of introducing the three panelists that will also be serving on this panel. First, we have Chief Thomas Kelly, who has served as the Chief of Police for the City of Ithaca since December of 2023. Prior to his time with the City of Ithaca, Chief Kelly spent more than 20 years with the Schenectady Police Department, where he rose through the ranks from patrolman to police lieutenant, while also receiving a certification with the FBI National Academy. An alumnus of SUNY Albany with his Master of Public Administration, Chief Kelly has been intentional and present about his desire to better relations between the Ithaca community and the officers that serve it. Our first panelist, Chief Thomas Kelly. Secondly, we have Tylee Mugambi, who serves as the Director of the Office of Ultimate Reentry Opportunity at Cornell University. URO looks to assist formerly incarcerated individuals with job placement, healthcare, transportation access, and the stigma that many times coincides with having a criminal record. The hope is that via proactive involvement, formerly incarcerated individuals will not become repeat offenders and assimilate into society post-incarceration. A husband and father of two, Tylee holds a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of California at San Diego and a master's in counseling from San Diego State University. Tylee is a life member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated and works within the fraternity to better outcomes for the communities they serve throughout Ithaca. Presenting panelist two, Tylee Mugambi. And lastly, we have Terrence King, who is a final year PhD student at Syracuse University, where he is poised to become the first African-American male to receive the PhD in special education in the school's 150 years of history. Dually, Terrence is the youngest elected pastor of St. James AME Zion Church, Ithaca's oldest place of worship still in operation. An alumnus of Lemoyne College with a degree in sociology, as well as the Metropolitan College of New York with a master's in special education. Terrence has spent well over a decade educating some of the populations oftentimes forgotten about living in the margins. A member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated as well, Terrence is proud to be of service to Ithaca and its citizens. Just gonna jump right into our panel questions. The first question is, from your experience, what do you view as the largest barrier to reintegration of formerly incarcerated individuals?
I guess I'll lead off, since that's my arena of work. And as I thought about this question, I could easily sit up here and tell you housing, employment, um, transportation, health and wellness, but it goes deeper. When we think about the challenges that people face when they come back home, and the life that they've had to leave all the way up until that point in time in which they became incarcerated. And as I was thinking about the Reverend's sermon this morning, I attended virtually. He talked about this ultimate healing meal. Healing is this thing that is really resonating in terms of what does it actually take for people when they come home to truly reintegrate. But how does healing happen? And how can we as a community facilitate that healing to happen for folks? And then the question comes, what work are we doing individually. Even if we look at the service providers, who are largely non-reflective of the population that they serve, culturally, racially, etc. And what work have they done for healing? Oftentimes we come in and we want to fix people. It says Department of Corrections. So they're there to correct you. And so this is the approach that they take. I just recently had one of my neophyte brothers contact me, and he was looking for help, and he was saying that we do all of this work, we give them all of these resources, and they go back and they do the same thing. And my response is, what healing did you help facilitate in that person so that all of the baggage and the things that they carry up until this point have less impact on them and the decisions and the choices that they make, so that they're doing it in a framework of resilience. And resilience requires that we have a community that has done work on themselves to be in a position to help someone else. If we haven't done that work ourselves, we can't see the true need of the person that's in front of us. So ultimately, we as a community have to be collectively working on ourselves to actually help the individual. This is heavy, right? Each and every one of us. I just attended a restorative justice training, 3-day training with the DA's office. And each day, as a Center for Justice Innovation took us through these workshops, each day folks had heavy work that they had to do, heavy reflective work, that when they came back the next day, they talked about how heavy they slept or how they didn't sleep because of what came up in the sessions. And what was one of the main things that came up in the sessions is, how are you relationally? Not just with the people who you work with, but with your family as well. How are those relationships from grandparents to parents to siblings? What harm has happened in those spaces, and what healing and restoration has happened in those spaces? When we talk about people coming home, they're coming home from a place that has been brutal, that has dehumanized them, and in that place has not restored any of their humanity. Most likely has taken their humanity. So when they come here, when they come back home, and we expect that because you spent all that time in that space, that you can get it together, and that is absolutely opposite of the truth. So I have building resilience within the community, restoration being a focus, and then also, we're talking about a pipeline here as well. So what is it? Is the education system doing this? What is the teacher's mindset in terms of the bodies that are in front of them that seem to be maladjusted or just not lacking a desire to perform, or just a behavioral disruption? Are we working to intervene on those children's behalf so that they can perform in a way that they can thrive and be successful? We have to address that stress that is within the home, that is in those bodies, that is post-traumatic, that is also post-traumatic slave, right? Traumatic, and then foster healing. And that doesn't mean to say that just because that is the Black experience, that there's not a white experience as well, because they came from a feudalist system in Europe that beat and brutalized bodies as well. And that's where our suffering comes into place, because that is exacted on us. So it requires a deeper healing. Healing and well-being is our primary focus in our organization. And that came to be because we have this housing project called the Sunflower Houses. OAR, who's not represented here, actually is the implementer of that program. But the number one thing that we are finding when we do interviews for people coming into that program is adverse childhood experiences and trauma. And if you go from first grade all the way to 12th grade, if you make it that make it that far without being interrupted by the juvenile justice system, you've got 12 years of work to help this body to be settled, to be regulated, to be better regulated. And so I could go on. I'll leave it there for now, but
So Tally brings up so many fantastic points, and certainly some of the work recently I've been able to do with Tally and the reading of the book from Remsen, My Grandmother's Hands, talks about a lot of the different trauma in Black bodies and white bodies. And before I go there, certainly I think another great point is community and how important it is in the role that community plays in settling people and providing guidance and providing opportunities and guiding our youth early on when they're growing up and setting guide rails for them. I mean, as youth, you know, we've all made mistakes. We've all had our issues in childhood, but how we're treated and how our family affects us, how the community affects us, really puts us on a path in life. And certainly, having worked with a number of individuals coming out of the from incarceration, coming out of the criminal justice system, there's so many different experiences. And as Kelly said, you know, the horror stories that you hear. But then I've also heard from some who have said that's what I needed. I needed to know that what I was doing was harmful and what I was doing was causing pain. So many of people within the criminal justice system that I've spoken to that talk about the trauma and that unsettling that led them down this path, and now coming out of the system have actually made it part of their life's work to prevent others from going down that path. And I think now that we're starting to really dig into what trauma does to people and how it affects people and the different types of trauma that people carry, and we're just now starting to kind of get to the tip of the iceberg on how can we prevent crime, because there are so many different contributing factors that, you know, we're just now starting to acknowledge. But especially coming out of the system, I think community's essential in rebuilding relationships and providing support for people to help them come back into society.
I think succinctly, Brother Tali and Police Chief have surmised it pretty well. There's a saying that says it takes a village to raise a child. There's some pushback on that saying to suggest, but did the village get the memo? And if the village didn't get the memo, then the child grows up to resent the village and burn it down. The reason why we have a problem with reintegration is because we're not wrapping ourselves around those who are coming back into the community. As a result, then they resent the village, and then the recidivism rate becomes effective. The school to prison pipeline is real. I just visited the Finger Lakes Rehabilitation Center with the young adults, the young men over there. And I had a conversation with the education director who told me that 80% of their body is special education. Not necessarily because they truly needed the services, but because they are in a system that doesn't know how to acclimate themselves to the lived experiences and the learning styles of Black and brown bodies, that the result of that is for them to be implemented into special education center, which then segregates them from the population because they don't have the skills to be part of the common population. So again, in summation, when we receive them in a way that we wrap ourselves around them to encourage them to be diligent and be fruitful with their endeavors, then we will see a change in a reintegration, truly.
Thank you for your answers. Leading into our second question, your answer kind of tied into it. How do programs like the local ultimate reentry program, alongside the proactive practices of law enforcement professionals, address barriers related to reducing recidivism?
Yeah, so it takes, so when I heard, actually when Chief was, speaking and he said, we're just now at the tipping point, and I heard someone out there say, just now at the tipping point? Well, um, you have to, you actually have to have an organization that is really focused on identifying the root causes and challenges and finding ways to address it. Otherwise, you just have folks out there working their hardest to execute programs. This didn't work, that didn't work, and applying for grants to do another program for another 4 years that doesn't work. I see the heads rolling up there, so you guys have the experience. Um, but our organization truly focused on the root cause and trying to work and get down to it. It takes time to get to that, and it takes funding to get to that place where you can say, you know what, wow, like trauma is significant, but how significant is it? Oh, wow, it's the thing that is across the line, the thing that is impacting us. How do we address that? And you see some author who's written a book and you say, well, let's start having this conversation. And specifically in how does ultimate reentry work with law enforcement in reducing recidivism? Well, I exposed this man right here to this book, and he will tell you that he opened it up, and in the first chapter he wanted to close it. But we're lucky and blessed that he didn't just close it, but he's not a quitter. And so he kept reading. And by chapter 7, he's like, how do we do this at the police department? How do I get my officers to read this book? How do we get them trained in this? How can we implement community resilience training, which is one of the presentations that we bought during this book read. So part of it is time. It takes time for a community. We've kind of, if we got a cheat code now, if someone wants to come and look at what we were doing here, and we also got lucky to get a chief that was open because the previous chiefs weren't open to working with us. They would come and they would talk about all of their challenges and barriers versus how do we work collaboratively together. And then this guy is now coming, proactively to me to work. And that's what you want in a police department, and an officer who's willing to kind of put his feet to the fire and saying, I'm invested. That's part of the challenge. And so if you can get a community that has the resource of identifying the root cause where we can intervene, and then having a local carceral system. When I say carceral system, I'm talking not just the police department, but the probation department. And although the probation department has now have guns for a particular administration of their work now, I still view our Department of Probation as proactive. We have a sheriff who's very open to what we're working on as well. So when we talk about recidivism, we're talking about the body re-entering the community. What is the state of the body re-entering the community? Is it healthy? Is it prepared for the challenge? Part of our research showed that what the food that they're feeding the folks in the carceral system is not, what did you call this morning? Healing meal is definitely not a healing meal. It's a body breaking meal that is meant to ravage the body. So we've worked with the local sheriff to have a garden up at the jail that now can provide healthy food that can actually go to the kitchen to help build those bodies up. So it's these small opportunities where you can shift the mindset and the approach of the carceral system, but be aware that there's the Department of Corrections is up here. We're here locally. So how do you impact the whole system? You have to kind of bring this philosophy, have it bought in here locally to where it can matriculate up those echelons of power. So yeah.
Yeah, and just to continue off of what Talia had said, it's, you know, it's so essential is the re-engagement and building trust and being there's so many different reasons why, you know, people do get involved uh in crime. So understanding that, and certainly we know that mental health plays a component as well. We know that substance use plays a component, and there's just so many things that we don't understand. And the more that we're working together, which is important, it's not one organization doing one grant, another organization doing another grant, but that we're actually working and communicating and learning and making changes uh, as we're working through this process here.
Um, I'm actually a bit of a bookworm. I've never heard of this book, so I would be interested. Thank you.
Whoever wants to
Okay, next question says, who are the partners necessary to help reduce crime? How can the community help in doing that?
I think everybody is a partner in reducing crime. Law enforcement is just one piece of the puzzle. Really, law enforcement is the caboose of the train. We're the last, you know, really to be that should be involved. You know, you have the community, you have families, you have the school districts, you have so many different organizations out there, especially in the city of Ithaca with GIAC, with the Youth Bureau. There's so many different activities to take part of. And so, you know, really, law enforcement is just one piece of that. And I think this might even run in a little bit to the next question, but engagement is essential, and not so much or not having this us versus them, but a collaboration of working together. Law enforcement playing a role as, you know, leaders, and as you know, helping to be mentors and helping to redirect you know, the activity I talked about earlier, you know, being juveniles. I've heard so many different stories, obviously from my own personal experience, but then I've heard those same stories in the city of Ithaca, the officer that everybody knew that would walk the beat, that, you know, if somebody got in trouble, like that officer brought their kid home and talked to mom, was like, hey, you know, let's take care of Junior here. And there was that relationship where people knew the police. So I think that's essential in building community and preventing crime, preventing the different types of issues that we're talking about. If we're not working together, and there's kind of like this cloak or on knowing of each other, how can we have a community?
So just like the chief said, if I look at from the lens of the church, uh, I believe that the churches have been void of prison ministry. We've perfected tending to the least, the left out, and the looked over, without actually factoring those who are coming back into our communities from institutions of imprisonment. With that, it's important to also acknowledge, specifically if we're talking about the church, we talk about Bible-toting people who know scripture from back and forth, but don't really recognize that most of the Bible written by Paul was a man who was part of the system. So we have to, as church, be integral in making sure we implement initiatives within our bandwidth where we are actually blessing and helping those who are in the system, who are coming out of the system. Because again, if we don't wrap ourselves around them, then there's no incentive to truly remain out.
So I would take it a little bit deeper in terms of what the chief was saying here in terms of right now, parents are stressed, fatigued, you know, in this economy. especially if you look at what it costs to live right here in Ithaca. Folks are at their wits' end and still having to do the parental duties uh, at the price of what it costs today. So I would say that parents need to be in this partnership. Much as the young man who was up here talking about voting, what's important for voting, I think it's the education. When the parents are dealing with enormous amounts of stress, the kids absorb it, they take it, and they do what they're gonna do with it. So how do we respond to that stress? It's the same stress that we're responding to in terms of interrupting that carceral pipeline. So what does it look like to build resilience within our schools so that the parents feel supported by the school system? The school system can then also feel supported by the parents and actually raising up these young people. So the single family unit is really a tough sell, but we need to build stronger community. Building communities is what's going to really eliminate the carceral pipeline. So if I'm working on my stuff and I'm addressing it and I'm healed from it, then I can actually help you and heal you. If I haven't, you're going to trigger me, you're going to activate me, and I can't do that work. To me, it's building the community that's going to be our strongest ally to reducing crime. So, you know, some of us grew up where the next door neighbor was checking up on you just as much as your parents were and knew what you were doing, was calling your house and letting them know what they were doing. But also, what's that restorative aspect of what did that child do that was wrong? How is that healing conversation being happened? And then vice versa with the parents and the children, right? These kids these days, they're smart. They're online. They view everything, right? So they want justice. They want restoration. So we've got to adjust ourselves as well. We can't stay entrenched in our old practice and belief that we grew up in. So teachers and administrators. So part of what we're doing, this grandmother's hand is a component with the teachers at BJM, a component with the Department of Probation, and as well as with the police department. So these are our partners. We've got to. So just wanted to share something, right? So a few months back, I was at a poetry venue downtown, and you know, there's other poets around and whatnot, and one of the young people there was looking over his, kept looking over his shoulder all the time, and then he kept talking about the police in the back of his mind. And I told him about the work that I was doing with the chief, and he was like, I don't want to hear nothing about that. Anything y'all doing, like, blank that, you know what I mean? And I had to get down to the bottom of it and come to find out that he was a cousin to Sean Greenwood, who was actually, you know, murdered here by a police officer, someone that, officer that he grew up with. So there's this sense of injustice that happened, and there was no restoration, there was no reconciliation for that. That officer isn't here anymore. There's different officers, but because of that picture, because of that trauma that that individual faced at a very young age, that's where that person is at. So it's very challenging for folks to bridge and develop a relationship with what perceived to be my enemy. And so when they look at me, yeah, I'm an outsider because I'm not from here. But I'm doing this work. Many of those people haven't been healed in order to actually get to that place to do that work. So we have to give grace for that. But as he said, he's not the enemy. When I work with them, and now I see officers in the community because they come to the book reader, they come to the Center for Criminal Justice that Mona Lita Smiley is running, and the police officers come. They're getting a genuine interaction and relationship building where we're excavating the trauma, we're talking about it, we're building. That creates a humanity amongst us in that space. We wish it could be greater, we wish it could be bigger, but it's only going to impact those who participate. So I guess my message is participate, be engaged. If you hear about something going on like a book read or the reimagining public safety, get engaged, be a part of it. Because all of it, it's gonna take all of us to be that solution to where we all are seeing each other as human beings versus the traumas that are inside of our bodies that prevent us from connecting with each other.
Thank each panelist for their answers. Yeah. I think that that question as well as the last one were kind of intertwined. They kind of answered the last question. So for the sake of time, we're going to get into one of the questions that was asked by the audience, and then we'll go into a break. What are your thoughts around incarcerated folks or formerly incarcerated folks gaining the right to vote, and how could we potentially move those efforts forward?
Let us pray. Um, here, well, it's a very loaded question. Um, Given the context again of who wins, if this country elects a person who is a 34-time convicted felon, we need to really look at how we are othering other felons. Because for him to hold the highest office in the country, yet those who come home have certain restrictions on their freedom and liberties, is antithetical to what we call this democracy. That's what I'm gonna give you.
Enough said.
Certainly, it's something that, and I've heard this in other conversations. I mean, in your duty as part of society is to speak, you know, to have a voice. So it's certainly something that I can't imagine for myself not having that voice.
Also one thing, so these bodies that are imprisoned mostly up here in the upstate area, those bodies can be counted for the rolls up here, but not from where those folks come from. So it's an injustice that happens when those bodies get to be utilized here in the carceral pipe, I call it kind of like the carceral region of upstate New York. So we should allow those bodies that are incarcerated to actually vote in the districts that they come from, that they represent, because guess what? The resources that are allocated for folks once they return, those resources locked up in Department of Social Services, they should have a vote in those precincts and those districts where those funds will be allocated to. And so right now it's kind of it is an uphill battle. I think we have one of the assembly members who's in the building who's actually fighting for that to happen. Sure. While incarcerated? Yeah, that's what we're talking about. Yeah. When they're incarcerated, I think was the
It was
question.
both.
Okay.
It was both.
Oh.
Yeah. Mhm. Okay, I'm gonna pass it back over to Gavin Mosley. Another round of applause for the panelists, though.
Get up too soon.
If folks could take their seats, I think we're gonna get started with the last panel here. I don't know if it's on. I can yell, I know. There is a video that's happening, yeah.
I know. I also walked in.
Folks, we're gonna get started with the last panel of the evening here. If everybody could take their seats. Really lean. All right, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Erica Smitka. I'm Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of New York State. I'm really happy to be here and excited to be a part of a panel with so many incredible individuals and to hear from so many of all of you this evening. Thank you for joining us for the last panel of the night, Women's Rights as Human Rights. We're going to dive into one of the crucial and most timely issues of our current day, which is the ongoing fight for reproductive freedom and its broader impact on human rights. In a world that's seen significant shifts since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, we're reminded that the stakes really are high, not only for women, but for everyone committed to a society where access to healthcare is essential and needs to be universal, autonomy is respected, and freedoms are protected. So today we're going to explore the intersection between reproductive rights, disability rights, and LGBTQIA rights, and really ground our discussion in the shared belief that women's rights are human rights. So we're really fortunate to have, as I said, an esteemed group of individuals with me today. So I'll introduce them all, and then we'll dive right in. So on the end, we have local disability rights activist, Larry Roberts. Larry has lived in Ithaca for 38 years. He grew up in Danby and has been involved in local issues for a very long time. Larry is the former program director and currently serves on the board of the Finger Lakes Independence Center. Thanks for joining us, Larry. Next to Larry, we have Tilia Cordata, also known as Dr. Andrew Sheffield. Oh, I'm sorry, Sheldorf. My apologies. Tilia serves as the chair and founder of the Ithaca Pride Alliance, or IPA, as well as being one of the most prolific drag performers and queer educators in Tompkins County. They served on Cornell's Student Mental Health Review Board and was an active voice in Ithaca's Nightlife Safety Commission, as well as a Drag Out the Boat ambassador. Thanks for joining us today. Next to Dr. Sheldorf, we have Dr. Jada Hamilton, who is a family medicine physician in Ithaca, New York, and has decades of experience in the medical field. She graduated from the University of Rochester Medical School and is currently serving as the Director of Medical Services and Interim Chief of Clinical Operations and Services at Cornell Health. She arrived at the university in August of 2013 after serving for over 20 years in the U.S. Navy as a physician. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Deirdre Hay, who has been a lawyer in the United States for many years, both in DC and Ithaca. Her most recent case was suing the state attorney general on behalf of the Elizabeth Cady Stanton Trust to enact legislation in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. She was president of the Women's Bar Association of New York State, which is an organization of attorneys pursuing equity and fairness for women and children in Albany and beyond. Deirdre has 2 law degrees, including a doctorate in merger law and economics, and she currently works at Cornell Law School as the director of LLM and International Career Services. All right, so we're gonna dive right in and ask one of the basic questions, which is really in a post-Roe and now a post-Dobbs world. Why is the fight for reproductive freedom so important? And let's start out on the end there, Larry.
So if voting didn't matter, we would probably still have Roe in place because the people who opposed it wouldn't have been successful in electing the person who is most singularly responsible for overturning Roe. So it really matters who shows up and who pulls the lever or colors in the bubble. If women and people who can get pregnant don't have the right to control their own bodies, and nobody does. And for people with disabilities, controlling our bodies is really an important thing, and saying what our bodies are and what our minds are and how they work and what they do and our abilities and our disabilities is incredibly important. I'll talk in a little bit about the history of struggle for people with disabilities, but that's where I would like to leave it. If women and people who can get pregnant don't control their own bodies, then none of us do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, echoing everything that you just said, and also thank you for using inclusive language of people that are able to get pregnant, because I think at this point, most people are aware that this is not just an issue of women's health, but also gender diverse communities and people. And I think that's an important thing to highlight. I also think generally that it's important to keep in mind that overturning of Roe v. Wade and kind of deliberation of a lot of the background precedent that led us to having reproductive protections in the US is also at stake. The right to privacy, which is the underlying thing behind a lot of these decisions, was questioned in opinions and op-eds about this, and that came from a kind of a combo case of racism as well as homophobia. It's important to remember that as one protection gets chipped away, more are chipped away and more are opened up to be redeliberated and rediscussed, and that puts all of us at risk. Yeah, I mean, at the base, if, like you said, if someone can't make decisions about their own health, about their own healthcare, their own choices, then it really means that none of us can. And I think it's important to highlight that queer and gender diverse folks that might be pursuing reproductive health care are far less likely to pursue it due to concerns about bias or uncomfortability. If you are someone that does not identify as a woman, it might not be super comfortable to go to a women's reproductive health clinic. And so allowing reproductive health to become more accessible to folks, regardless of how they identify, is important. And in order for that to happen, they have to be protected as well. I don't know.
Can y'all hear me okay? Okay, excellent. So I echo everything that's been said. Excellent. And I do feel that, so reproductive freedom definitely impacts individuals' rights to really make decisions over their bodies and their future. And the ability to have accessible, safe, legal, trauma-informed reproductive care is really essential to people's well-being, people's autonomy, and really fundamental in just making sure that we're all here to live our best lives, our best health as we can. And without that, we're going to be, it's going to be very hard to really have healthcare that's equitable for everyone. And I do want to mention that without these types of rights, this really disproportionately negatively impacts marginalized communities, marginalized individuals who have been historically marginalized. And really, it just exacerbates what already is existing inequities in healthcare, right? So I think the point that we want to bring home is that reproductive healthcare, reproductive freedom equates to all of our freedoms and our freedom to get accessible healthcare. And I think it's important for all of us to remember that. I'm a mom to 4 adult kids, and their futures and being able to access care is important to me. So if y'all have aunts and uncles and cousins and sisters and moms and dads, this is going to be important to you all too.
Thank you. So, given the question is, why is the fight for reproductive freedom so important? When one of the presidential candidates says that he's going to take care of women whether they like it or not, what does that actually mean? And we all know his proclivities and all that, which I won't go into. But the other reason is that the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, provided an analytical framework which lays a map to take away more fundamental rights. And so really the case, the overturning and the post-Roe the Roe world is really dangerous for a whole bunch of reasons. Justice Thomas stated the goal clearly. He called for the court to overrule case law that established the rights guaranteeing birth control, intimate relationships, marriage, and equality. It also puts doctors at risk because they might get arrested for doing their job. And that actually happened in Roe v. Wade. The one of the people who were arguing at court was a Texas doctor who joined in the lawsuit arguing that the state abortions law were too vague for doctors to follow, and he'd been previously arrested for violating the statute. So that totally changes the landscape and means that many doctors are too scared to operate. And I've seen on Facebook posts that women in Texas, particularly, that's where my Facebook posts seem to stress this is happening. Women are bleeding out in parking lots, waiting until they're critical because the doctors can't operate until their life is in danger. So they're coding in the parking lot and bleeding out and dying. So it's pretty awful. As the lawyer on the panel, I figure out of these three questions we're doing, it could be helpful to just talk a little about the cases so that there's a little basis. So Roe v. Wade, and I had to look this all up too because I just wanted to refresh my mind. The Jane Roe was an unmarried pregnant woman, and she filed a lawsuit on behalf of herself and others to challenge Texas abortion laws. And the Texas doctor joined the suit, as I said, because the laws were too vague for the doctors to know what to do without getting arrested. And at that time, it was illegal in Texas unless it was done to save the mother's life, and it was a crime to get an abortion or to attempt one. And the court decided two main things. The US Constitution provides a fundamental right to privacy, which we heard about before, that protects a person's right to choose whether to have an abortion. But the abortion right is not absolute. It has to be balanced against the government's interests in protecting health and prenatal life. Texas defended the restrictions, saying that states have an interest in safeguarding health, maintaining medical standards, and protecting prenatal life. A fetus is a person protected by the 14th Amendment, and protecting prenatal life from conception is a compelling state interest. Luckily, they didn't win. And they also said the Texas law invaded. Hold on, printing's not very good. But the court decided that the right to privacy comes from the due process clause, and the meaning of liberty must be broad indeed. And in Roe, the court decided that it extends to control over pregnancy. And they said the being forced to continue a pregnancy puts a lot at risk. So mental health, physical health, financial burdens, and social stigma. So they're all good reasons why we need to get this Roe v. Wade principle back. And it also had a structure. The court created a framework of trimesters. So during a person's first trimester, the court held a state cannot regulate abortion. During the second trimester, the state may regulate abortion if the regulations are reasonably related to the health of the pregnant person. And during the third trimester, a state may prohibit abortions unless an abortion is necessary to save the life of a pregnant woman. And then the death rates dropped after the decision. And people who argued against it said the Constitution doesn't explicitly talk about abortion and should be left up to the states. Others said that a person should be protected by the Constitution at conception. And it was very polarizing. And then the Casey case came along, Planned Parenthood and Casey, and that changed the framework of the decision-making from the trimester system that Roe put into place to fetal viability, which was found to be between 24 and 28 weeks. So the court in Casey and Planned Parenthood said that a pregnant person can choose an abortion, but states have to regulate based on fetal viability. And then there were some more cases. Texas reduced the number of clinics because they wanted to reduce access to abortion. And there was a case of Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt. But the Supreme Court said that the states can't restrict clinics if that places an undue burden on women. So it's Texas's nasty way to get Roe overturned by restricting access and making it pretty impossible was found not to be allowed. And then the Dobbs case, where I already told you about the Justice Thomas. So it's really bad. And then this is why I've been fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment forever, like for a decade or what have you, when the New York State Bar Association said, oh, what's this bit of legislation? Do we care about this bill that's been hanging around in the legislature for ages and not going anywhere? And I looked at it and I went, oh, the ERA, that sounds kind of important. Yeah, I'll draft a position statement on that. And then when I became president of the Women's Bar Association, I really pushed it hard. There's a fantastic movie called Equal Means Equal. It's on Netflix. I really recommend it. And there are two versions, a short version and a long version. And I sent it all around the state to the different chapters of the Women's Bar. And I just remember Justice Antonin Scalia saying, there's no duty to discriminate against a woman, but there's no duty not to. And I just really recommend that you have a listen to the Equal Means Equal video. Thanks.
So I think we touched on a lot of important things that folks said. One of which is having our rights protected in the Constitution. So I'm going to do a little pitch here for folks who aren't aware. On the back of the ballot this year, you'll be voting on Proposition 1, which would codify basic protection against discrimination for all New Yorkers here in New York State. One of those being access to reproductive care, access to abortion. But the other thing that a lot of you touched on is really this more holistic look at reproductive health, and that it's not just reproductive health, but it touches so many other points of our society. So my next question for you all is, from a health standpoint, both physical and mental health, what is at stake if women or non-binary folks do not have access to reproductive health care? Let's start in the middle. Dr. Hamilton, I'm going to start off.
Here we go. So yeah, and I think we touched on a couple of things. So I think one of the biggest, there's like several things that I think about when there is limited access to reproductive health care. The first one is basically, if you are unable to access care, that means you may have a chance that your care is delayed, treatment's delayed, or you don't get care at all, which can lead to significant physical, mental health, and trauma harms. And that's just not good, right? The other piece of this is lack of access, lack of care can lead to increase in the pregnant person's complications and even death. And we're thinking about women who are going through a miscarriage, women who have a pregnancy that is not implanted in the uterus or in your womb, and women who are just having excessive bleeding as a complication. I mean, women can bleed out and die if there are not interventions that that are had. The other piece is increased in, as we say, infant mortality, so death or complications related to the baby or the fetus, and that is related to if a woman or a pregnant person is not allowed to have a decision about what to do next for her pregnancy, that is has a child or has a or infant fetus that is has congenital abnormalities, cardiac abnormalities that are not consistent with life. Those infants get delivered, they don't make it, and that just also puts a lot of trauma and pressure on the family. Other piece is the cost of care. The cost of care for women who can't access care, maybe have to travel state lines, leave their jobs, leave their families. That's a big financial burden. Insurance pieces, if you're not covered. And the other piece is if, I was worrying about the cost of care. I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Oh yes, complications related to bleeding, needing emergency surgery, that also increases the cost of care. So those are the things that we want to think about. If persons don't have access to reproductive health care. And it's something that we all need to think about, as I've already said. Oh,
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a medical doctor. That's not what my doctorate's in, so I'm not gonna give medical suggestions beyond what you said. Completely agree. I just again highlighting that like this is going to affect the most marginalized folks in this discussion. And in almost every case, that means Black and brown folks and queer folks. And especially when there's already uncomfortability of pursuing reproductive health care if your gender identity does not align with it, that is going to cause more problems for the queer community, more issues for more negative outcomes in healthcare generally, as well as loss of preventative care that could be pursued, especially if it is separated and ostracized for, you know, non-binary folks, trans-masked and trans men. But it also, I think when we talk about healthcare, we often seem to focus in on what communities it affects and what people and what types, but it's important to think of healthcare as also a whole community of like, we all exist together. It is better when we can access our healthcare and take care of ourselves and live like healthier members in a society. And so removing any of these protections, making it more difficult, making it more uncomfortable, reducing access hurts everyone, not just the people immediately impacted.
So I quickly wanted to address just this idea of, now abortion is a state's decision and that's what it should be, and a lie that somehow that's a good thing. In the early 80s, people with disabilities who were active at the federal level began to say, you know what we need? We need a law, a disability rights law that covers several areas and that needs to be national. It can't be in New York State, the law is this, and in Texas, the law is this, and in other places, the law is this. And none of that was born, the Americans with Disabilities Act, because people with disabilities recognized that it shouldn't depend on where you live, who you know, and which state is more progressive or more conservative or whatever you care about, what your fundamental rights are. And one of the things that's come out of the Americans with Disabilities Act and out of laws in New York State that are slightly tougher than the Americans with Disabilities Act, is a lot of attention now on healthcare facilities, on providing accessibility to people with disabilities, people who are deaf, and people who are blind. We're making slow and incremental progress. I could talk a lot about why that is, but I won't because it takes a long time. But I did notice the last time I was up getting my kidney taken care of that they finally have a wheelchair accessible scale so they can weigh me. Right, so I could actually find out how much I weigh. I weigh too much. But this has all come about because the Americans with Disabilities Act exists. So it doesn't matter what state you live in. Well, it still does, but there are certain fundamental rights that are in place.
So with at risk of sharing too much information, I've had more miscarriages than I can remember how many I had. And one of them was when I was away on holiday and I didn't know where to go. And if I'd been in Texas or Mississippi, I don't know what I would have done. You know, I had to go to the doctor and be seen, or I don't know what would have happened. That was one of the worst ones. But anyway, on a lawyerly viewpoint, as someone who's worked in big law firms where you work 14 hours a day sometimes, I noticed that in Australia, you can get the contraceptive pill 6 months at a time. When I moved to America, I had to go every month. And I don't know if that's changed or not because I don't need it anymore, but I don't know. I think it's changed. How many can you get now?
Like
A year. Excellent. Well, that's really good. But I found that a bit backwards that you had to go every month. Sorry. You know, you've got to take time out of the day, go and see the doctor, and yeah.
Thank you all so much. I think we have time for one more question. So our final question of the evening will bring us back to coalition building. So from a coalition building standpoint, why should reproductive freedom be just as important to men or non-binary folks as it is to women? And we'll start here and work around this way.
Okay, so from the legal point of view, men might be paying maintenance when they don't need to be or want to be, and that can affect their lives as well. And they might not like that. So, you know, there could be a situation where neither parent wants the child, and it's really good to have reproductive freedom because of financial consequences, and also society should be fair. So that's really important from an equity point of view. Men might want to be parents and adopt. There could be a gay couple who wants to adopt. They should be allowed to. And I'll leave the transgender point to our expert here.
Great, thank you. And so I also, just a couple of quick things. So because reproductive health care is healthcare, reproductive freedom is freedom to get to access healthcare. And if we all advocate for reproductive freedom, reproductive health care, we're basically saying that we all want a healthcare system that is equitable, that's fair and just, so that we all can be in the best health that we can. And I also want to just frame this as, you know, I'm a physician, and you know, we have sort of this code of medical ethics, right? There's like 4 pillars, and I'm just going to read them because otherwise I'll forget and say them wrong. But this is sort of where I come from, and this is how I view healthcare in general and delivering health to individuals, to our communities, to again optimize their health and well-being. So the first is respect for autonomy. So respecting the patient's right to make their own decisions. Make their own decisions. Beneficence, I think I said that right. The duty to do good. So limiting access to care is not doing good. Justice, treating all people fairly. It's pretty simple, you'd think, right? non-malfeasance or malfeasance, whatever, sorry, the duty to not cause harm. It's pretty simple. So if we are protecting reproductive freedom, reproductive rights, we are following the pillars of medical ethics. And that's what I hope to be able to sort of convey to everyone. I hope to be able to, for our communities, to be able to say, you know, we're doing this for everyone because everyone deserves access to healthcare and deserve the right to basically live as healthy as they can. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, I mean, kind of addressing just the question itself. Why should men care about reproductive health care? I mean, there are men that can get pregnant. There are non-binary folks that can get pregnant. Men, as far as I understand, you know, from my very basic level sex ed from 7th grade high school, it takes two people normally, or at least the genetic material of two people to create a child. So it's not a standalone act, and it's not something that it's just people that can get pregnant's issue. So it should be a care to cis men, trans men, non-binary folks, queer folks, women, trans women, everyone, because we're all affected by it. I also want to come back to like the community health standpoint of like when we are able to be in charge of our own healthcare, when we are able to make informed decisions, as a community, the health outcomes get better. Restricting what healthcare people can access on lines of gender or what organs they have damages the community as a whole, and also puts undue burdens on folks that might need to travel for medical care or to an area that is more welcoming or inclusive. And that's disproportionately going to affect folks that are already being hurt by our systems that are in place. So why should people care? Because we're people and we should care about each other at the underlying of everything.
So as I said at the beginning of my take on this, if women and other people who can get pregnant can control their bodies, then nobody can. I fundamentally believe that. And one of the reasons I believe that is because the decision in Roe versus Wade was founded partly on the idea that we have a right to privacy and we have a right to bodily autonomy and the ability to make our decisions. Right now in the United States, it's possible to be locked up in a mental hospital if you are perceived to be mentally ill and you are perceived to be a danger to yourself or others. There are many of us who are working to make sure that the rights of people who are in that position are respected and cared about. If we continue on this road of removing basic privacy rights and basic bodily integrity rights, the kinds of painful things that can happen to people will become even more difficult for society to deal with. We should be making progress towards developing systems of care that are voluntary and not having to always fight about what is a person's body about, what is a person's mind about. Those decisions and those things are so intimately complicated that we need to have a right to privacy and a right to bodily integrity in order to have productive decisions about where are the lines and what is society's role in relation to an individual. I heard the other day one of the candidates for Congress in our area say, in New York, abortion is anything goes. And that's simply not true. There are ways that abortion is provided in this state that are guided by a woman's right to choose, a person's right to choose, and the balance between what what society's responsibilities are and the right of the individual, as is always the case, or should be always the case.
Thank you all. I think something that you've all kind of hit on here is really this holistic view of health, and the idea that we really should be looking at health from a community health perspective always. As we know, and going back to the ADA, even when we have things codified in law, we see those laws broken all the time. So there will always be a challenge, and there will always be a fight to ensure that folks have access to basic human rights. So I don't know that I'm looking at Gavin. Do we have time for any questions for the audience? No, we're all set. Two? Okay. I don't have any written questions. So if anyone has a question from the audience, just raise your hand. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us here this evening. Oh. Probably a question for our lawyer on the panel, so I'll pass it.
So I feel that the Equal Rights Amendment will solve everything, and that's Prop 1 effectively. So if women are treated the same as men, because before any Equal Rights Amendments, people of different race, color, creed, or religion get freedom from discrimination, but women don't. So we're in a worse position than, and also trans people and, you know, all the combinations. So, so we need equal rights, and luckily Senator Kruger stood firm and didn't just limit it to women, and she included everybody, and that's what Prop 1 is. So it's, if it is passed, then at least in New York State, we'll have a fantastic time. I don't know if it's
No,
federal,
just on the ballot in New York State.
Yeah.
Because it's a change to the New York State Constitution.
And then the other thing is the federal Equal Rights Amendment, if that gets passed, then, and maybe it is passed, there's an argument that it already has been passed and that the expiration of the deadline doesn't matter because you want, and then the reversal doesn't matter either, because once the state said yes, then they can't unsay yes because it's an important constitutional thing. There is an argument that it's already forced, but the person in the archives didn't declare it, and none of the presidents have said archivists declare it. So there is an argument that it's there, but it's not really held by that many people. But the thing about it is that the standard of proof in discrimination cases without the ERA is higher to prove. So a woman fighting for something, you know, related to abortion or maternity leave, whatever, I don't know, she's going to lose that case most likely because the standard of proof is so high. Whereas under the Equal Rights Amendment, it will bring the standard of proof to the same level as someone suffering discrimination for gender, for race, religion, creed, etc. So personally, I think that would really help. But I don't see any other way through the courts because it's so conservative and it's all tied up. You know, we've got more beer and all those people. Thank you.
Any comments from the other panelists?
Oh, no.
lost to all of our